native earthworms on a wide range of native organisms. He is intimately involved in different approaches to deer management at Cornell and in the surrounding municipalities. And he's the chair of the Cornell Deer Management Committee. Bernd has developed a network of deer exclosures to study the impact of deer on many species and processes, and is developing bioindicators to assess effects of different stressors, including deer. The ultimate aim of this work is to increase the conservation values of all land through development of best management practices. Now, I understand that a winter storm has moved into the Ithaca area and is complicating travel, and we're doubly grateful that you could join us this evening, Dr. Blossey. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Blossey.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil, for this. I'm safely in my office, and hopefully we'll be safely going back home as well. I would thank you and the organizers and the technical support and everybody who's on this Zoom call for the participation. These are the questions that you posed to me. I will try to answer some of them. I will address all of them to some extent, but the time is too short to really go into all the details that we have. I do this in collaboration with many different individuals in my team, students, postdocs, undergrads, people outside the department in different management agencies. We work in New York, we work in the Northeast, we work in Wisconsin, we work in Scotland, and I will not be addressing all the people that are involved in that. I wanted to initially just make a statement about this, and I consider what we'll be talking about today, what we'll be addressing, and hopefully we'll have some questions to go back and forth on. It really is a wicked problem. Deer management and everything associated with it is a wicked problem because it questions our role in nature, our responsibilities. It questions traditions that have dominated the way that we deal with deer. It questions institutions, their role, their makeup, how government is responsible for certain aspects of it or not. It questions the trust in government and the trust in experts. It has questions around accountability, and it involves our personal ethics. There's more than ecology that goes into deer management. It's data, it's our social responsibilities that we feel, our political attitudes, and everything is intertwined. So there are many, many talks that we could give, or I could give, and other people could give about this. We need to be reasonably short. I will not spend all my time in getting to example after example after example of what people have documented in terms of impacts. I will give an overview. I've also tailored this presentation to the audience. There will be no equations. There will be no statistical tests. I can provide the evidence if people are interested in that one, but this is not an academic department of ecology or wildlife, so I will try to be respectful of that. There will be graphs, of course. There will be pictures. There will be no gory pictures, so I don't need to have a warning up front. But because this is so intertwined, I would like to first start or asking you to go on a journey with me of where I'm coming from, because this is so deeply ingrained in where we're coming from as individuals, so that I would like to make some initial personal statements. And it's reflected in some of the attitudes that I have. It's important that we recognize that words matter. Words can be hurtful, they can frame things in a certain way. For me, hunting is not a sport. There are no game animals, even though that is how it was developed. It involves taking of the lives of animals, and that is not a sport, neither is it a game. Animals whose pelts are sold are not fur bearers to beautify humans, they are mammals. Wolves and mountain lions should be allowed to return. That's my personal attitude. It's not the attitude of many of the people that sit in agencies. Animals and plants have language and culture. Humans are not unique. We may be not smart enough to understand how they're talking in chemical language or how to communicate with an electric eel. We could have an entire talk about that. I just wanted to put that up front. Personally, I care about and want to protect native species and ecosystems. and that's without prejudice. I manage deer to prevent negative ecological and economic impacts. That's the guiding principle that I try to follow. Furthermore, humans are part of nature. We are not apart from nature. Ecosystems and biotic communities also change over time, whether that's climate change or historic things like glaciation. Humans have shaped and are shaped by species and our environments. Whether that's the release of wolves in Yellowstone, whether that's the elimination of passenger pigeon, one of the most abundant species on this continent, by hunters, whether it's trying to restore coral reefs, reintroduce butterflies, or show whooping cranes how to migrate with an aircraft. These are all interventions, inventions, and attitudes that we have of trying to fulfill a role that we can heal some of the ills that we have brought on ecosystems. Because we understand, and again, this could be a talk by itself, that human well-being is intimately linked to healthy ecosystems. And this all goes back to Aldo Leopold and many other conservation thinkers. He called it a land ethic. It reflects the existence of an ecological conscience, and this in return reflects a conviction of individual responsibility, my emphasis, for the health of the land. Health is the capacity of the land for self-renewal. Conservation is our effort to understand and preserve this capacity. This is coming from the Sand County Almanac that many of you may have read or at least heard about. And I will try to put some more science, maybe some experience behind these words to showcase what this actually means in reality and when we drill down. Conservation is intimately linked to demography, and it's the importance of transitions. I have 3 examples here. Many of you may have heard about the word demography, may not fully understand what it means. I'm trying to illustrate this. For a species to continue to survive and live, it needs to make these transitions from an adult stage. Let's talk about the bluebird here, that needs to, from an adult, find a nest, a partner, lay eggs, raise fledglings, you have a juvenile, and then returns to the adult. At each of these stages, mortality occurs. Eggs may not hatch, a predation event may occur, the juveniles may fly into a window, lots of different things may happen. But the transition from one life stage to the other, that's what we ultimately think about when we use demographic forecasting of how large or how small a population would be in the future. We're trying to do that for human populations. We could do it, for example, of an oak that needs to go from acorn to from a germinating seedling to a small sapling to a mature tree, dropping acorns again. Those transitions, all of those transitions need to occur for the species to thrive into the future. The same goes for red trillium here at the bottom that needs to come from a seed to develop over many years to cotyledon to a small leaf individual to a large leaf individual to allow to flower and then produce seeds again. We need to enable all of those transitions. We cannot just rely on one of those stages because if there is an interruption in these transitions, the populations will plummet and the survival of the species would be at risk. All of you have seen landscape like this. I call these unhealthy landscapes. It's because of a lack of understory, a lack of a shrub layer, and the transition, let's say for a tree or even a herbaceous species from seedling to adult does no longer occur. This example here in the center is actually from last year that we collected in Wisconsin. This is where they released elk. You may see a browse line that's much taller than this individual here. That's elk browse in Wisconsin, where they have been reintroduced. So it's not just white-tailed deer, it's not just the Northeast where we see it, but this is the biodiversity preserve of Binghamton University. Nothing is preserved in here other than the existing trees, a browse line, and many other species are unable to find a home and a living space here. And what we also increasingly recognize is that in aquatic environments like ponds, deer are functioning almost as moose would function further north, eliminating a lot of the herbaceous variety at the water-land interface. That's something that's not very well known. We're starting to study this as well. So these are unhealthy landscapes. You probably all have seen that. You may not have recognized that these are unhealthy landscapes dominated by large trees, but nothing that will follow them once they die. So the core of the issue here is, are deer really at the center of a human health, economic, and an ecological crisis? That's basically my hypothesis, or that's where I will be talking about today. Deer create these unhealthy ecosystems, favor invasive earthworms. I will not be talking about that today. Favor ticks, reduce the beauty and the diversity of forest understory plants, endanger pollinators, endangered bird species that need to make a living on the forest floor. And ultimately, that would prevent our ability to use carbon capture by regrowing trees to help us with CO2 and carbon capture. Deer are at the center of it all. That's what I am talking about today. So what do we know? And I'm not going to go into a lot of the literature here, but I'm going to rephrase some of the things that is not really contested ground. Deer are ecosystem engineers. They're key for Lyme disease. There is no Lyme disease in New York City, in Manhattan, or in the surrounding boroughs until deer arrived. The doctors in New York weren't able to diagnose that, and people were picking up Lyme disease and ticks outside of New York City. There's a long-term study in Connecticut that shows the link to deer. Deer reductions are important. Hunting is not good enough in reducing deer numbers below a certain threshold. But if you reduce deer numbers, you will eliminate Lyme disease to a very small amount. That has been done on islands. And so why are deer so important for Lyme disease? Because they function as the only adult host for adult ticks. So they quest higher up, and they need to have a deer to actually produce large numbers of eggs. So deer are responsible for ecological deteriorations. There are thousands of studies. No new evidence is actually needed. So why am I actually talking today? The questions that are always asked are, how do we know that the effects that people have studied somewhere occur locally and affect our neighborhoods, plants, birds, insects, and so forth? And how do we know that deer interact, or are the causal agents here, and how do they interact with other stressors, whether that's pollution, invasive species, climate change, all these other things? It's not something else responsible for what I call unhealthy landscapes? And what level of deer reduction or population size is needed to allow recovery? So how do we know that deer are responsible? Here are some scenarios that we would typically use in a scientific situation to try to understand what the causal factors are. Ideally, we would have chronosequences, that's meaning over time, to see how deer abundance and different deer density would affect the different things that we are interested in to study, whether that's forest regeneration, or whether that's birds or amphibians or mammals that may be affected by deer. FIA is an acronym for Forest Indicator Analysis. So that's an established thing that the Forest Service has. They have standardized plots that they are revisiting for decades and trying to understand what forest regeneration does. But it doesn't exist everywhere. You needed to start this many, many years ago, decades. Establishing a control is hard where you reduce deer abundance, and it's not a good representation, but often the only possibility. And there are no areas in the US with low deer populations. So we don't really have a standard to compare where other factors are the same. Maybe the deep woods of northern Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire are examples where deer populations are at low levels where we can still see beautiful understories. But even that is questionable and would need verification. So then the other possibilities, if we can't use these long-term chronosequences of monitoring, is fencing. Fencing is really difficult. I will show you an example where people have fenced deer and what the responses were. Typically, fencing is used to exclude deer, but that's also not a good situation. We don't want to exclude deer entirely, but very often that's the only possibility that we have. Then we can use direct browse measures. Here are some of the things that are advocated for: avid, tentalis, twig age. I'm not going to go into the details, That's a talk by itself, and you can ask me questions if you want to. The problem with a lot of these is that they can't account for legacy effects. What are legacy effects? These are decades of deer browse that have occurred, that have sorted out plant communities, and in many instances have eliminated a lot of the plants that we would expect in a forest. A lot of these direct browse measure situations require that you go and you find things that you can measure. If everything is gone or the sensitive things are gone, you have very little things to measure. So what we have, or there may be nothing in some places. So what we have started to do is what we call sentinel plantings. These are basically bringing out species, individuals. We've done this a lot with oaks, but we have done other situations, other species as well. I will talk a little bit about it, but again, this is a talk in itself. But what we are trying to do is to allow citizen participation, to allow local evidence collection where no PhD is needed to actually collect this information of how deer are affecting local environments. So the forest inventory analysis has been used to do regional analysis of what is actually happening to our forests and whether the forests are healthy or not. Here's just a shot. You can see the East Coast or the Northeast. These are considered northern hardwood forests, and the inability for these forests to regenerate because the saplings are lacking. Not the seedlings, but the saplings are lacking. Here is the paper that was published about that happens throughout the region. And at these browse rates, so that's the main take-home message. There are other factors, of course, that are in there. At these browse rates that deer have, our forests will not be able to turn over after the old trees are dying or are being harvested. This is just for the woody species that is analyzed here. Just imagine what is happening to the herbaceous plants that do not have a vertical escape, meaning they're always short enough that deer can always browse them. A tree, if it's protected long enough, can get out of browse height. Herbaceous species do not have the capability to do that. And we can watch, right? Sometimes direct observations are the best. We planted out some oat seedlings at Lynn Leopold's place and then put a camera up. It doesn't take many deer to eliminate a whole bunch of small oak seedlings that we just planted a couple of days ago. So this doe is going from seedling to seedling that we planted. Maybe she now realizes somebody is watching. So you can have the direct evidence. That's not necessarily good enough to then fully understand whether this has a population level effect, but we can have this. John Kelly in New Jersey has then looked at deer density using like night surveys and others. There's all kinds of issue with how you measure or try to assess abundance of deer, but I will just use his work here that was published in 2019 to look at the number of deer per square kilometer and what is happening to saplings. Again, these saplings are basically taller individuals. They're no longer just a foot or so tall. They went through the initial recruitment phase. These are woody species, and you can kind of see that once you need to be well below 20 individuals, maybe at 10 or lower than that, all of a sudden, those saplings that are able to regenerate at these low deer densities. I don't know where he found these low deer densities, but there are not many points that you can see here that would be sampling areas. Most of the deer densities that we have in our areas are well beyond 20, well beyond 30, and well beyond 40. But nobody really knows how many deer we have because they're very difficult to count. We don't have good assessments for that. Here's an experiment that people did at the Forest Service. It's called the Allegheny Deer Experiment. I call that an engineering diversity experiment. Basically, what happened is that after some clear cutting, large areas were fenced and then stocked with deer to simulate different deer densities. You can see the deer densities that people were trying to achieve per square kilometer. And the problem that was when you have fences like this, deer always try to escape at high deer densities, and the nutritional problems that deer encounter at high deer densities results in deer welfare issues and others. So this thing was abandoned after 10 years. But the take-home message basically is one from the bottom up. That's the effect that you see. The higher the number of deer per square kilometer, the fewer trees you will have in the system. That trickles up the food chain. The fewer trees and species of trees that you have in the system, the fewer caterpillars will be there, because the number of trees, the diversity of trees will reduce, or a lack of diversity of trees will reduce the number of insects that can be living in there. The species diversity of insects, but ultimately will affect the breeding birds. So you can kind of see this ricocheting effect. That's what Nuttall calls us in ecosphere. Very often what we see is deer density in rural areas, suburban areas out here. In a little enclave here around Cornell, we had 120 deer at 125 deer per square mile. You can only anticipate what havoc that brought to the local environment. So here's an experimental investigation. Not many people have repeated these because of animal welfare and logistical and expensive ways to maintain these exclosures over long periods of time. We've also done some things where we directly go out and trying to document what deer do. It's really, really difficult to document if something is not there and what the reasons are for that. So occasionally we can go in and see, oh, we have a situation where on a ginseng here, ginsengs are browsed. This is a deer browse. We can distinguish deer browse from lots of other herbivory by the fraying, because the deer basically rip the stem off or the flower off. So we can distinguish between deer herbivory and rodent herbivory, for example. And this picture here is a beautiful trillium spring wildflower situation in the forest. And the flags here is a single browse event of a deer wandering one evening through this. You remember what the deer did to the planted oak seedling? You can imagine a deer just walking through here and taking a bite every step that he or she took. Every single flag that you have here is a eliminated, browsed, flowering trillium. That was one evening, one afternoon, one morning that deer went through there and just did that. You need to multiply this by the deer that are in the system, and you can see it doesn't take many deer to create major problems for some herbaceous and woody species. It's not only native species that are affected by it. We and other people have shown a lot of effect on invasive species that are then favored by deer. That's a direct competition between native species and introduced species, but there are other effects that I can't go into much detail here. And then maybe microbial feedback loops and others, feedback loops with earthworms. If you take deer out of the system, you reduce deer abundance, you reduce earthworm abundance as well. I'm not going to talk about that. That has all been done before. But here are two examples from two favorite widespread species introduced, one from Europe, garlic mustard, the other one from Asia, Japanese stiltgrass. You fence areas, and that's the only thing that we did. This is work that was done at West Point Military Academy together with Andrea Davalos and Victoria Nuzzo. In the fenced areas, the density of garlic mustard and the biomass of microsporidium went down within a couple of years without any other intervention. The only thing that we needed to do was prevent deer access. So we can manage plant invasions and other invasions, for example, earthworms, through managing deer. We've done a whole bunch of series of, again, trying to understand what are the long-term consequences for some of the charismatic or not so charismatic native species. This is work that we have done on our own property, where for years we have monitored by singly and individually labeling white and red trilliums and then recording the browse. We did that in fenced areas and unfenced areas. What I'm showing you here is for white trilliums on the left and red trilliums on the right, the proportion of individuals that are not fenced that are being browsed. The dashed lines here indicates a level of browse on reproductive individuals that is tolerable by these species, and they can still maintain populations into the future. That was a demographic analysis by Tiffany McKnight and Susan Callis that they published. So we've taken that. If 15% annually of individuals that are browsed, that trillium population will be able to maintain itself and be stable. What you can see here, that in very few years for white trilliums, is that threshold or is the browse rate below that threshold. Very often it's much higher, but there is seasonal variation, or I'm sorry, not seasonal variation, but annual variation that we can't fully explain. It may be a variation in the deer abundance, it may be some other effects that are happening. And the same years are not necessarily, or the deer are not necessarily threats to the same individuals or the same species in every year. So look at 2011 here. So the browsing on white trilliums that flower slightly later than red trilliums is acceptable. But for red trilliums, it's not exceeding the 15% threshold. So there's variation between species, things that we don't understand as of yet. Other than what we can say is at the current browse levels, trilliums will disappear off the landscape if we don't do something about it. Here's another example for false Solomon seal, and it's just a quick calculation on the on the back of an envelope, if you want to speak that way. Again, these are individuals in fenced and unfenced areas. And over time, what we see is a recovery, but the recovery is slow. So if you protect these individuals over time, they become bigger, they flower and produce seeds. And so if they are behind fences, this is what you're going to get. Of all the individuals that were there, 57 flowered. The number is basically the same. If you were not protecting them from deer browse, only 7 individuals were able to flower. The seed output is 24, the average if you are protected, and 10 if you are unprotected. That's creating a cumulative effect of well over 1,000 seeds that are produced by protected individuals versus less than 100 for unprotected individuals. So now you need to look through the lens of demography once again and say, oh, what does that mean? I have 2,000 seeds almost where other things can eat that. They may find a good place to germinate or not, but the risk that you lose all the individuals is much higher if you only have 70 compared to almost 1,200. So we magnify the problems that the plant species and other species have if they are not able to produce large amounts of seeds and survive into the next generation. One of the problems with fencing, and I want to go into this a little bit of a detail, is if you go out and you just fence a plant or an environment and you go and look at the species richness and what's happening over time. These are, again, once data from Wisconsin, from West Point. You may not see an immediate response. We see a very, very slow response of the community. We see a faster response of individuals. So I want to focus on this, on species richness and vegetation cover. So these are basically 4 years where we put fences up and then followed in square meter quadrats what is happening to the species richness. So basically plant community, and you see no change. In the cover of the vegetation, we see no change. There's no difference between the fenced areas and the unfenced areas. This should not imply that there is no effect of deer, but it is what I call a legacy effect. For decades, the deer have sorted out the plant communities at West Point. So only those individuals, those species that are able to tolerate and live under this high deer browse pressure are still existing in the community. So you're just putting up a fence. You're basically asking who is coming in, who can take over the species that are there now. That's a very, very long process. Maybe it takes many decades. It needs, the seeds need to be there. There's no good seed bank for them to recruit in. Maybe we need to do active restoration. So if somebody comes in and says, I put up a fence and there is no difference between inside and outside, so deer don't do anything, that's not the right way to ask this question. So I will stop here in terms of the evidence of what do we know, what deer do. And so there's many, many papers that I can share with those of you that are interested in reviews and others. The question is, what can we do about it? And we can basically now separate the ability for deer management into things that are lethal methods that involve hunting and culling, and non-lethal methods that are sterilization, or basically we tolerate the deer abundance that we have, or translocate it. I'm going to go into the first three in a little bit of detail. I don't think learn to live with it is something that we're willing to embrace because of the negative consequences to other organisms that I feel is a requirement for us to do something about it. And the translocation is neither allowed, nor are there places that would be with open arms taken in deer and said, please send them to us, we have too few. So the last two are really not something that we should be considering in this context. I will talk a little bit about the Cornell deer management that we have done. Cornell, the surrounding communities, as Phil started to say in the beginning, have suffered from high deer populations. They deteriorate our outdoor classrooms. There are safety and health concerns through Lyme disease and other things for the employees and our students. But we also had a lot of public pushback early on and said, well, hey, you can't just shoot the deer on campus. You need to do something about it. So Paul Curtis, Jay Boulanger, and some others did work on saying, hey, let's evaluate whether we can do recreational hunting and facilitate that every nook and cranny that's safe to hunt can be hunted, work with sterilization. And this is a $500,000 study that started in 2008. Every deer that we could get our hands on, or they could get their hands on, was then captured using dart rifles, got an ear tag. Many of them got radio collars so we could follow where they are. You can see that on the doe here. And then the fate was looked at, and they divided the area to really understand what sterilization would do, what hunting would do, and what nothing would do on the Cornell campus. And all of this you can access if you want to read the science about it. This is open access, not behind a paywall. There is the DOI, and just click on it and you get it, and you can read up more about it. But we had an area where nothing was done. The deer were still captured, but not sterilized. And so to have that, there were areas here in light brown where recreational hunting was allowed. And we had a sterilization zone centered around campus. I came along with a new method to then fully understand what the impacts of deer are on the vegetation, because that was ultimately the goal. So the Cornell aim was to reduce deer populations by 75%, and then also reduce their impacts by 75%. Having a marked population allowed us to do some fancy math to then trying to understand how large the population is using camera traps. That's what you can see here. I will produce some of the results that we had. But one of the things that we needed to do, because some of the landscapes were really depauperate, is how can we measure what the deer impacts are if there's nothing that we can measure, or these things are deer resistant or too tall or whatever. So we developed something that we called an oak sentinel approach, where we grew large numbers of oak seedlings from acorns, red oaks. That's easy done. Put them in a refrigerator, wake them up, grow them up into small individuals, 20, 30 centimeters tall, a foot, plant them out. We protected some, like here, in cages, allow others to be unprotected, and then measure what happens. All you needed was a drill. The person is strong enough to put a drill into the ground, and then you measure, and then you go out and census what is happening. So this is like an early thing. It happens really fast. If you protect individuals, their survival rate is really good. These are the number of unbrowsed individuals. We put out 20 in cages, 20 without cages. If they're not protected, their survival rates really stink. Basically, the deer eat them within a few weeks after they were planted, down to very little. Here are just two examples from two sites for illustration purposes. So this is a larger overview in these areas that were either sterilization areas, recreational hunting areas, or where nothing was done. And so the idea then was there should be a difference. And guess what? There's no difference. If you protect the oaks in cages, their survival rate is around 80%. That's really, really good. If you do expose them to deer herbivory, their survival rate, or browse, the ones that were browsed, is between 20 and 30%. That's just in the first year, right? These little seedlings need to grow over many, many years to become saplings and get out of browse height. This is just 3-4 months of exposure to deer. And you can see that basically there's no difference. So statistically speaking, there's no difference between when you do nothing or whether you do hunting or whether you do sterilization. The oak survival rate is much reduced, but it's not the locations where we did the study, because if you have small seedlings in fenced environments and small individual cages, they do well under the same canopy cover and others. But you expose them to deer, their survival rates go down to near zero, particularly if you do this over multiple years. So now, the deer problems around the Cornell campus and some other that I would call suburban areas, even here around Ithaca, may be really, really high. So here is a little situation where we looked at browse rates. So this is like the reversal of it, and where the hunting and hunting pressure is actually sufficient to help you with some of that. And so I've ordered, these are just different places, right? So this is Finger Lakes Land Trust, there are state parks, there's the Atkinson Center places. It doesn't really matter much, but what you can see, if we say an acceptable browse rate, an annual browse rate of oaks is around 15%, we can talk about that, whether that's okay, but it's similar to what is for the trilliums. And you have an increased hunting pressure that goes with no hunting pressure as it was in Cayuga Heights down to very limited hunting pressure in these places. And then this one is an outlier. And that's our property that I manage. And we throw all kinds of things at the deer. That includes, of course, lethal management, and we're able to reduce deer numbers. And all of a sudden, if we do that, our oak browse rates are really, really low. However, the browse rates on white trilliums, these were data that I showed you before, still exceed acceptable levels. So our oak sentinel index only gets us this far. But what it shows, that while hunting does make a little bit of a difference, overall, it's not strong enough of a population control effect that it will allow oak regeneration to occur. And there's no chance for white trilliums and other more sensitive species to make a living in areas that are just hunted and not otherwise managed. So what we then did based on this evidence, we said we needed to do more at Cornell. So we created a program that the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Bureau of Wildlife, allows us to do. It's basically nuisance permit, or the official word is deer depredation permits, DDPs, that allows hunting over bait, which is not allowed in New York, hunting at night, which otherwise also is not allowed. And so we did that, tried to implement, worked it up for a season. And because it's close to human habitation, sometimes in backyards, we only allow bows and crossbows. And so what that may look like here when we start that, we have a feeder here, some corn is being put out, deer come in and eat the corn. This one is without a feeder. We often use like little shrub piles and others to guide deer so that they're actually coming in at the right angles and with the right exposure to allow close shots. We have a number of shooting locations. As I said, small woodlots or backyards. We have a long season where we can do this. We have participant training. We use tracking dogs to make sure that all the individuals that are deer individuals that are wounded or so, are we trying to find them? We have a code of conduct document that lays out how hunters, or we call them now participants, have to observe. Venison is being donated to food banks. And what that allows us to do is basically a 3 to 5 hours effort for every deer that's being taken versus 50 to 60 hours in the recreational program. So we're much more effective. And we were able to then reduce deer populations around the core campus and surrounding areas dramatically. So here is what the populations were doing. And remember, we had a marked population that allows us to then do estimation of how many deer we had in what we call the core campus area. So early on, before we implemented this deer depredation program, this is basically the number of deer that we estimated fluctuated around 90 to 100, maybe a slight increase there. And this was the number of deer that hunters were taking, actually hunters plus cars, because we could detect the mortality based on the collared individuals that we have. So that took about 40–50% of the deer every year, fluctuated with deer abundance, didn't help us much. Once we implemented the deer depredation permits, all of a sudden, our populations started to plummet, and you saw that here. Unfortunately, the efforts were not strong enough, so there's a year when we got a lot of donations, so to speak, from the surrounding areas. Deer immigrated into the areas that were now vacant lots, basically, and we needed to do it again. So this is what you can see, but overall, we were able to reduce deer population using this approach. It's not sufficient to what we want to do, and more effort is needed, but we showed the university and the management agencies that we can do it. In comparison, in about the same area, in 1 year, 2017, that's the number of that's the number of deer that were killed by cars. So we are killing many fewer deer than traffic accidents in Ithaca, where it's basically 30 miles an hour throughout the city. So what we also showed that was important for our Oak Sentinel approach was that the browse rates were a function of deer density. So this graph is maybe a little reversed because we started in 2010 had the largest deer abundance around 100, and then we were able to reduce the deer abundance down. And you could see that with the deer reductions that we could calculate, because we had a marked population, that the browse rates were down. So we now have a functional relationship between deer abundance in our area, at least, and deer browse rates. The browse rates are still not down enough. You remember that it was like 15% down here, where we needed to be to allow oaks to regenerate, and for trilliums and maybe even more. But we could show that we could do something that was better than recreational hunting using this approach. Not sufficient though. So what were the lessons that we learned? So what we found first was that suburban and rural landscapes are under severe deer pressure. People estimated, like when we started in a little village called Trumansburg out here, that they had about 100 deer. We started with the DDP program, and then the next spring, Trumansburg paid for infrared survey using forward-looking infrared, and they said, we have about 100 deer, we shot 90, the next spring there were about 140. We're not quite sure whether they're residents because it's in and out, so the error in the estimation was plus minus 100%. That's what our managers will also tell you. But what we also recognized here with the work that we did, that the threads are poorly known or recognized. Non-lethal methods show absolutely no promise. I'm going to go into that one in a moment. Recreational hunting is not able to reduce populations to ecological acceptable levels. Yes, they do kill some deer. Yes, there may be a little help of slowing the deterioration, but ultimately they will not be able to help you out. Deer reductions then occur through vehicle collisions. Not a good way to die. Only 50% of the deer are typically found that are killed along roadsides. And the available toolkit that the agencies may deliver to us or we are willing to take on for deer management is rather limited. So the recommendations then that I have is abandon non-lethal methods. Don't even, think about that anymore. Although I know many people will. Recreational hunting is okay where possible, but regulated market hunting needs to be added to the mix to reduce deer populations. That's the only way that I can see to maintain enthusiasm and willingness of people to continue to do it after their freezers are filled. Large predators may help once deer populations are greatly reduced. Allow them to return, but be prepared and adjust your behavior or the way that livestock is being handled. Ultimately, we need to require documentation of effectiveness of deer management from the agencies and municipalities that engage in that. Opinions are not enough. Everybody is entitled to their opinions, but data are absolutely needed for that. New methods may be needed to be developed, but it is the responsibility of management agencies and municipalities to develop some of these methods. So if I were to summarize what I just said, I could just simply say there's nothing new here. Some details, some nuances were added, but where is the holdup? So what we're really facing is tradition and institutional arrangements from hunters and agencies that have catered to hunters for 100 years. Vocal and well-organized minority groups, particular hunters and animal welfare activists, that's who we hear of. That's what's being shown in the media and others. And local governments do not see species or ecosystem protection as their priority. It should be, as much as it is school children or vehicle safety or others. I think they need to embrace that responsibility as well. Conflict avoidance, because you have loud voices coming to, and you hear that, just makes the status quo endure. That's unacceptable if we are to be good stewards or conservationists. This reality was described in many different books, here, many different papers. Here's just an example of it about deer. The Nature Wars by Jim Sturber details our relationship with beavers and geese and deer. And so nothing much new that I can add to that other than putting it into a different, larger conceptual framework. We're not alone in it. The high abundance, large populations of large ungulates or large browsers and grazers is happening in what we call the global north, all over the place. It could be kangaroos, it could be camels, it could be red deer, it could be donkeys, it could be horses. You go around the continents and you will find that. Our way of dealing with that, regardless of how wildlife is being managed, ownership of wildlife, hunting rules and regulations and tradition, we see this. So we are not alone in it. There's a challenge that comes from a traditional view of some ethicists, and I'm going to go into the conservation and sterilization challenge here right now. So here are two books that some of you may know, some of you may want to consult. Some of it is more dense than others. So there's some traditional view of these ethicists that go with rights of individuals is the most important and only philosophically sound ethic. Humans have no right to violate rights of individuals, that's non-human individuals, taking their lives as unethical. The world biota are then separated into those that are sentient, able to feel pain, and those that are not. Under this view, sterilization is okay. My interpretation of ethics and moral responsibilities is very different. So I would argue that species and ecosystems need to be the units of our ethical and philosophical concerns, not the individuals. Under this view, we recognize that birth and death are part of life. Predation is everywhere, even if we do not witness it. Life without predators would eliminate the vast majority of species. Each species is afforded to live and die its ecological and evolutionary potential. There's many more things that we can talk about in this sense, but for me, it's important that rights, in quotation marks, do not follow taxonomy of sentience. Butterflies, moths, frogs, fish, trilliums of oaks do not have reduced rights because we declare them less sentient. And what do we know? We don't speak their language, we don't feel their feelings. We don't know what we do not know. Humans, as I said before, are part of nature. Differences are gradual. Important here, humans have agency. We can, and I would argue should, right the wrongs that we have put onto our ecosystems and species, whether that's pollution, habitat degradation, or other things. If we talk about the sterilization challenge and the implementation of it, what comes to be faced by those advocating for it is catching deer is really hard. Getting to all of them is impossible. Immigration overwhelms local birth reductions. So sterilization works only in fenced areas where you prevent immigration to replenish your local herds. Sterilization renders most females infertile using surgery. There are no oral contraceptives. That's impossible, and you would also need to get them multiple times. Impossible to do in the field. What happens is that sterilized females live long lives. Here for Cornell, we have individuals that are well over 15 years, and they continue to consume vegetation. Maybe it's because they don't have responsibilities to raise fawns, to lactate, and consume much more biomass. So they have an easier life and hence live longer. They look really well. For me, sterilization of wild animals is not ethically okay. We do that with pets and livestock. In my view, sterilization of wild creatures violates the rights of those individuals. And there's no published evidence that sterilization ever leads to ecological improvements. So what they claim, excuse me, advocates for sterilization is that you have reduced birth rates, which may be true. I'm not challenging that, but the reductions are never enough to get to ecological recovery. And then be aware of revenge effects. Here's something that I put together based on reports from the Staten Island deer reduction efforts that go through male sterilization. So that's coming from published reports that I analyzed. And what is actually happening is that deer reductions, according to their estimates, from 2050 in 2015-16, before male sterilization was happening, went down to maybe 500 less. The deer population on Staten Island, as I said, dropped by 500. Cars over that period killed 800 because road kills were tabulated. The interesting aspect that you can see here is that as the deer populations went down by 500, car kills actually increased. So what is going on here? Here is just the tabulation of what happens in different months. Typically, car kills are associated with the rut. That's happening late October, November, December, depending a little bit on where you are in the country. Bucks are chasing does to breed them. Roads are being crossed at with no reconsideration or consideration whether there are cars coming or not, hence all these deer vehicle collisions. So here, males are being sterilized because there are fewer males there. What is happening? Because the females are not being bred, they cycle again and again and again every 28 to 30 days. So what that does, it leads to an increased rutting period that extends way into the spring. So that increases the amount of time that bucks will chase does, even though they're sterilized. So they're basically shooting blanks, but they still keep shooting, chasing does because does are in heat. They smell good, so bucks will be chasing them, which leads to increased car mortality. This is not acceptable to me. It's a nice and interesting aspect. So, we reduce deer numbers by sterilization, but then you basically allow them to be killed by cars. Not a trade-off that I'm willing to accept. In a small enclave out on Long Island, in the town of East Hampton, lots of public opposition to hunting or others over, what is this, like a 6-year time period, almost 2,000 deer were killed by cars. Unbelievable carnage in the environment, no damage reduction in the forest, overrun by ticks and Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases. But stalemate because of outcries by certain interest groups. It's not the hunters here, but it's the animal welfare activists. Talking a little bit about the safety challenge, and then I will end here. Guns in the woods are a safety challenge. Many of you may be concerned about that, but it's mostly for other hunters. There are ways to avoid that. It's hunter behavior. It should blaze orange or other warning colors but mostly hunter behavior. Guns in suburbia for deer management are unsafe. Bows are fine, but discharge distance limits imposed by agencies or municipalities limits where they can be used. So I'm not arguing for getting all the guns into the into suburbia or into urban spaces and then shoot deer that way. I know that that is not a possibility. So urban and suburban spaces may need darting and euthanasia. So there's no safety concern for, at least not for human safety. It's already used in sterilization programs around the country. So that means you run around with dart guns and you put the animals under sedation and then get them sterilized in surgery or other ways. For me, it just means those deer would not get back into the environment. The problem that is happening with darting and euthanasia is that the venison cannot be used because it's not fit for human consumption. For now, and it's strange to me, is that there's little opposition from animal welfare organizations. That may change, but maybe they're so used to sterilizing pets or euthanizing pets once they're at the end of their life that that is an accepted way. I do not know. I don't fully understand it. So what then is about public attitudes about deer management other than the people that we typically hear of? Excuse me for a moment. So decision makers and agencies typically hear amplified and well-coordinated messages from hunters and animal welfare groups. We need more sophisticated sampling of attitudes other than you getting a questionnaire that asks you, do you want more deer, keep populations the same, or do you want fewer deer? That's too simplified, and it's not getting us to the answers that we need to have to argue about it. I'm going to present a couple of examples from the US, New York, and from Scottish residents, just as an interesting comparison. So here's a representative sample from a national survey that was done by my former department chair, Dan Decker. And it was basically asking whether people are accepting of hunting and what the reasons for hunting would be. If you are hunting to control wildlife, that's largely accepted by people, right? It's an overwhelming majority. Free-range meats, damage to ecosystems, spend outdoors, all of those things are supported. What's not supported is obtaining a trophy. So basically, the trophy hunting that you will see from a lot of hunting organizations and individual hunters, very few people are actually in favor of that. And that includes a lot of the hunters. Now, when we ask more sophisticated questions and say, would you be in support of deer population reductions based on a number of different factors that we have? And it goes from Lyme disease to road safety, starvation of the animals, forest and carbon capture, climate change, wild plants, economic cost. You will see that for most of those reasons, the overwhelming majority of individuals, this is a New York State survey it's representatives of 1,000 individuals that we asked here. 2/3 and more of the residents of New York agreed that this would be an acceptable reason to reduce deer populations. Increasing hunting opportunities, still a majority would approve it, but it's not that strong. That's the least supported one. So this is very interesting that really there is large public support to do this for the reasons that we asked about here. Very often we hear that there's a large difference between those people that live and grew up urban or rural. We do not find that difference. I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but basically every little column here is for carbon sequestration, forest, hunting opportunities, and so forth. And the difference that you always see between the top and the lower graphs here is the difference between urban and rural. Across the board, regardless of what question we are asking, there is no difference between urban dwellers and rural residents. So I don't know where that evidence comes from, but it is not for New York residents and it's not for other folks either. I talked a little bit about predators, right? So maybe getting wolves or mountain lions back is something that would help. At the present deer abundance, it will not. I can talk more about that if it's desirable. But we asked questions about the return of mountain lions or wolves. There are some that are suggesting that wolves have returned to the Northeast, particularly in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and the Adirondacks of New York. We can talk more about that if desirable. And we asked attitudes of whether wolves should be allowed to return. That's a top one here. Whether in mountain lions, so separated by wolves and mountain lions on the left, wolves on the right, whether they should be reintroduced or whether they are welcome. What you can see, there is no overwhelming support for reintroduction or recolonization of wolves and mountain lions. It's around 30%. That was very disappointing for us, but we need to realize that that's the case. Mountain lions are even less welcome than wolves are. But once again, there is no difference between urban and rural dwellers in the welcoming map that they roll out for big predators. I'm going to skip beyond that. The Scottish landscape, we asked the same situation. Scotland should be looking like a forest, not the denuded hiking landscape that we see now. That's a sheep and overabundant red deer effect. So we asked some very similar questions of the Scottish residents and asked whether they would favor deer reductions based on the different things, Lyme disease, deer starvation, forests, climate change, other animals, and so forth. And you will see there, similar to New York, the overwhelming attitude of people in Scotland is that they would favor deer reduction for all these ecological and economic reasons, but not for increasing hunting opportunities. It's called stalking in Scotland. And as in New York, here is the difference between rural and urban people. That was really important for the Scottish government who commissioned us to do this work. There's no difference between people living and having grown up in urban areas versus those in rural areas. Once again, very surprising, but something to reckon with. So overwhelming public support for increased deer management. Loud voices of special interest groups have prevented the appropriate action so far. We underestimate true deer impacts. No habitats appear safe. Deer crises are human-made. For me, humans have a moral responsibility to be better stewards. Individual welfare, animal welfare is important, but should not override larger conservation and species interests. There are implementation and assessment challenges that remain, but they are solvable if there's a political will to do that. But getting the political and agency will and the change of tradition will require some heavy lifting by those people that are typically not as vocal as the hunters or the animal welfare support people. Ultimately, whether we have diverse and thriving woodlands that have deer in them and salamanders and trilliums and tanagers and forest understories that look beautiful and are healthy for us, or whether we have these depauperate landscape with plenty of deer in them, but maybe overwhelmed by shrubby invasive species like honeysuckle or nothing in the forest understory, and they will collapse over time. These are not healthy landscapes. This is what I have to say. I hope I covered a lot of the things that people are thinking about. Somebody is scrolling on my screen. I'm not entirely sure who that is, but hopefully that didn't interfere with the presentation here. So thank you very much. Enjoy all life, not just single species. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Bernd, thank you so much. This is Bill Browning here.